title this Conor McGregor and P. Diddy. Reason being, in recent times with Keefe D getting arrested and possibly getting charges on murder for the Tupac case in terms of just involvement, not necessarily the guy that did the trigger pulling or anything like that, but rather the complicit or some kind of facilitator or ringleader in whatever they can bring up in terms of, let's say, RICO charges, where they bring down a whole entire gang rather than, let's say, an individual criminal act. So, nonetheless, one of the things you got to understand is that P. Diddy's time could be coming up. It's been a great ride. And you can almost say that same thing about Conor McGregor. Because the position that Conor McGregor is at right now, I don't honestly think that this guy is in the best shape to get out there and make a comeback. And if he does, being that it is Michael Chandler, it's just a matter of having the right style of matchup that he was afforded to. But later down the line in the top 155 divisions and maybe even the 170, if he wants to try his luck, he's going to have a very difficult time due to the lifestyle that he's been living. And I don't think that's groundbreaking news to say. Everyone says it because it's just the reality of the fact and what you see in front of you. The guy's out there drinking in the pubs when he's doing Ariel Helwani interviews for Matchroom content. He's out there drinking in Anthony Joshua's fights, drinking in Katie Taylor's fights. He shows up in Matchroom fights more than he shows up for UFC events nowadays. And yes, granted, a lot of that is just the simple fact that you're dealing with a regional proximity of Dublin and London being in the same area where it's a lot easier for him to have access in that. So you look at P. Diddy's career. He came from, I guess, humble beginnings, like anybody else that would come up from the world of rap music or in the world of professional fighting athletics. And afterwards, he found riches and success, just like the story of anybody else that we know that we admire or somebody that we aspire to. It's all a very stereotypical story. But you know what else is very stereotypical with P. Diddy and Conor McGregor is that there are going to be rises and then there's going to be big falls. And right now we are witnessing the era of the big fall between them. Is it that far-fetched that with a confession from Keefe D saying that he's the one that got paid or was supposed to get paid in the various stories that he has on this particular subject, could be the reason that, let's say, P. Diddy gets brought up on charges of being complicit of trying to pay for a hitman. And then that just brings down an entire bag of rocks while he's going up a hill in the mountains. Because you look at his life, you really thought in your mind that it's just nothing but up from there, right? From the time that he came out with Mo Money, Mo Problems. After Biggie died, he came out with I'll Be Missing You, a very big hit in the summer in 97. And then you go into his next phase of his career, MTV's The Band. You had Mace, you had the Locks, you had Little Kim. Look, you guys know the discography of P. Diddy and his work in the music industry. And you guys know the work of Conor McGregor as the two-weight division champion, the double champion, the 145 undisputed and the 155 undisputed. And then on top of that, you have him as one of the few guys to have ever crossed over into boxing, made a whole lot of money, and then created a business out of it. It's very similar. very similar to how they're how they were brought up in that similar way, right? And it's also funny that McGregor does have Notorious B.I.G.'s nickname. Not that it has any correlation to anything, but it's just a very strange coincidence that there's parallels between the life of P. Diddy and Conor McGregor right now, and he is the notorious one. And P. Diddy was the man that created the notorious in terms of creating a rap persona and somebody that he put out there in the world as a main producer. So what a great life, right? He was in that situation with Shine and J-Lo where they shot up a club. He manages to duck and dodge that. P. Diddy seems to duck and dodge a lot of things. He was involved in that shooting during the Biggie murder that night, meaning that he could have been one of the people that got targeted. So Puff has seen his shares of downfalls, just like Conor McGregor has seen his shares of downfalls. And this is an even bigger downfall if Conor McGregor happens to lose his next fight. There's no doubt about that. And in your all right. If you guys want to see the rest of that particular video, check out the title Conor McGregor and P. Diddy, Notorious Life. Time is running out. That is the title. Again, repeat it again. Conor McGregor and P. Diddy, period, Notorious Life. Time is running out. And the reason why I titled that particular video that was because obviously there's this big news going around about Tupac's case and the fact that they have found the killer, even though a lot of people all throughout the years have already known who the killer was at some point or suspected. But now somehow they want to make it official, make arrests and some sort of court documents to make everything right in terms of serving justice and whatnot. Well, lo and behold, a lot of that is going to involve P. Diddy because, as you guys remember, he was the rival of Tupac and Death Row Records at the time. So now, fast forward to 2023, all those years later, he's had a magnificent success as a music producer and as an artist. And not only that, also as an actor. If you guys remember, P. Diddy went and did a movie with Russell Brand, Get Him to the Greek, where he played basically a guy that was like himself, a music producer, trying to get this rock star or aging rock star to some sort of level of sobriety of some sort. But nonetheless, neither here or there. So what you're looking at with Tyson Fury, could you be looking at the same thing, which is the decline of one of the best boxers in this entire generation? Because it was only a couple of fights ago, it just seemed that this guy was the best. When he went in there and defeated Klitschko, who was a longtime champion, out jabbed him, outworked him, and on top of that, just outswagged him in the way that he used a lot of technical footwork to evade a lot of the hard shots that Klitschko was known to take his opponents out with. And in the Deontay Wilder fight at the time, Deontay Wilder had the same moniker with the likes of, let's say, Francis Ngannou, who was his knockout artist. Now, all of a sudden, this knockout artist looks human from somebody who looks more than human, looks like an average dude, but is only 6'9" in Tyson Fury. And it puts Tyson Fury's stock at a higher level. Now, right after that, it was just all these other different fights that Tyson Fury was in. It was basically just a tune-up fights to get him ready. You had the Derek Chisora fight in there, which I have mentioned plenty of times. The Dylan fight was there that I've mentioned a few times. None of these very challenging. It was very Tom Schwartz-esque, like if you remember one of those fights that Tyson Fury had during that time of when he was just trying to recover and get back into world-level boxing. So now we're in this situation where we have to basically assess the career of Tyson Fury. We got to ask ourselves, is this the same guy? Can this guy continue to compete at this level knowing that he has all this success going on with his Netflix. Not only that, he has success going on with being a big social media personality. Every time he says something on social media, everybody is up on it, especially with the John Jones fiasco he had going on, where they went back and forth and basically claimed he was the baddest man in the world. And then on top of that, Dan Hardy mentioned that he really believed, and so did I, by the way. I want to be very honest and give full disclosure of this. Said that Tyson Fury can beat Francis Ngannou in an MMA fight. And guess what? I was on board with Dan Hardy on that. Now, come to think of it, I just realized Dan Hardy was just being a patriotic British man in trying to basically up his fellow British fighter. Now, what were some of the plausible understandings that I had thinking that Tyson Fury is exactly what we think he is, formidable MMA heavyweight. Why did I think that? Well, for one, in comparison to Francis Ngannou, not comparison to, let's say, if he was to fight John Jones, because John Jones would just double leg him to the ground and pound him, and he would have no answers for it. But somebody a little less advanced than that, let's say maybe Francis Ngannou, who doesn't have the advancements of John's wrestling technique or the years that he's put in with a hard-nosed grind in wrestling mats in America. Okay, Tyson Fury has a chance against Francis Ngannou because I thought that he was the more experienced combat athlete overall. Overall, within his fights, he's had more fights than Francis Ngannou has had MMA fights. And then on top of that, you're not even counting, let's say, the amateur fights that Tyson Fury has had in the past, right? So he's just the more experienced combat athlete. And then on top of that, the reason why I had thought that Tyson Fury could beat him in an MMA fight is because of his footwork. If you guys remember Travis Brown, who was the current fiance or husband of Ronda Rousey, the way that he fought before he started training with Edmund Tarvarian in LA with Ronda Rousey, he was training in Greg Jackson's camp, which is, by the way, where John Jones trains at. 6'7" heavyweight, very similar to Tyson Fury. Guess what? He could also move his butt off, meaning that he had great footwork. He had that Dominic Cruz style in the heavyweight division, and something very similar to what you had seen out of Tyson Fury when he fought Vladimir Klitschko. Lo and behold, out of nowhere, somewhere down the line, he had just decided to change his style. Maybe it was just because of the fact that he went and started training at Edmund Tarvarian's gym. And you look at Ronda Rousey's footwork, it's not exactly the most crisp that it can be, right? It's not exactly Prince Nassim-esque, okay, or Dom Ingle-esque. And even Tyan Booth, I heard his live a couple of days ago. Well, not a couple of days ago, during the Tyson Fury Francis Ngannou fight week. He mentioned something to the effect where he can no longer fight the Dom Ingle style because he's no longer in that kind of shape. And if you noticed, Tyson Fury doesn't look like he's really moving in that same kind of way that he did in 2015. There's a small decline there. And you can notice it because this is the kind of style that he fights at. It's not like George Foreman or even, let's say, Bernard Hopkins, who has a little bit more of a plotty style. They don't move around with their feet as much. They don't have this razzle-dazzle dancing style to the way that they move. So you can't really tell. And by the way, having a style that's a little bit more plotty and doesn't move around a lot really doesn't exert a lot of energy. So if you are a little bit older, you can fight in that kind of style and save a lot of energy, but also, not waste as much energy, because let's just face it, if you train in a Dominic Cruz, Tyson Fury, Prince Nassim, Dom Ingle style of fighting, guess what? It's going to tire you out and you need a certain level of conditioning to do it. So we saw none of that with Tyson Fury. So that's one sign that you could say, all right, there is an aspect of decline in this. Also, that's the physical side that we're talking about, right? Because more on the physical side, how about the fact that it's been years and years that, let's say, Tyson Fury has abused his body. Now, granted, he got into better shape, got into a championship form, after those Deontay Wilder fights and after the Tom Schwartz and Otto Wallin fights. But even with the Otto Wallin fight, you sort of noticed and started seeing a bit of Tyson Fury's vulnerability. That's when it started happening. Is it because of all those years from 2015 all the way to, let's say, 2017 and 18, abusing his body, finally catching up to him? Because here's the thing about Tyson Fury you can't deny. He has skills. He's 6'9", and there's a lot of guys in the combat sports gyms that have told me you cannot teach size. And I think I've heard this conversation. We were talking about the likes of Brock Lesnar. You can't teach size. And that's, in the boxing sense, what Tyson Fury has. He has an absolute size on him to where he can get away with a lot of things. Well, now you look at this comparison with this fight against Francis Ngannou. What is his reach? 83 inches. Tyson Fury, 85. John Jones, 84. So they're all literally equal reaches. Now, all of a sudden, Tyson Fury is taking on somebody that is literally just his size. Now, by the way, if you have a reach that is 83 versus 85, which is what you have here with Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury, it's not that far off. You're literally fighting a guy your size. Sure, Tyson Fury is taller, but not by much, because Francis Ngannou is still 6'4", and you can't mistake 6'4" for what it is, especially if they have an 83-inch reach. Tyson Fury, 85-inch reach. And he's been able to exploit this with smaller opponents like Derek Chisora, even the likes of Dylan White, who's just a little bit shorter than Francis Ngannou, and even with the likes of Steve Cunningham, where you've seen he was in very much trouble in that fight, but guess what? Somewhere down the line, his size was able to save him. Just like in this fight this weekend, the corruption of boxing was able to save Tyson Fury. But the humiliation that he got from the boxing world still stands. Because you look at all the boxing guys, Carl Froch, George Groves, they did a show together. You're talking about two guys that hated each other, that were absolute rivals, that wanted to rip each other's heads off. Now, all of a sudden, they're doing a podcast together. And funny enough, Carl Froch was sort of slagging off freaking George Groves in that particular segment. He was saying something to the effect of, yeah, you know what? When you and I fought, I had to fight you the second time because I felt like I did not win, so I gotta fight you the second time, and this and that. But yeah, I beat you, and then I beat you decisively in the second part of the entire thing. And so he was just absolutely doing a number on George Groves, reminding him who the alpha male was in that entire podcast, letting him know, like, you know what, I beat you back in the days. Yeah. But at the same time, the one thing that they both agreed on, aside from the fact that they're both made peace with each other and now complete homies and mates, is the simple fact that George Groves and Carl Froch agree that Francis Ngannou belongs in the boxing world. And you know what's crazy about that? They can't say anything different beyond that, which is crazy. Because usually, these boxing guys, I swear, man, they have an absolute nullification to anybody that comes into their sport. They don't even take in accountability the aspect of athletic prowess that, let's say, an athlete has coming into boxing and then being able to pick it up so quickly. By the way, I finally got to see that video of Chael Sonnen saying that boxing is not a real sport. He mentioned something to the effect where none of these celebrities, none of these crossover athletes could go into the world of amateur wrestling and take on the likes of Alexander Karelin, Kyle Dake, Jordan Burroughs, Taylor, Sadulayev, that Dagestani heavyweight wrestler. What's the other guy's name? Kyle Snyder. Who else is the top wrestler in the world? Karim Ibrahim Gabber, the Egyptian wrestler who won the 2004 Olympic gold medal in Greco-Roman. All these guys, you cannot go in there if you're Logan Paul or if you're Conor McGregor or you're an athlete from a different sport. You can't go in there and out wrestle Kyle Dake. But guess what? That's the reason why you need MMA, because even though we know that Islam Makhachev could never beat Jordan Burroughs in a wrestling match, guess what? There's MMA for Islam to prove that he's the baddest man in the world, and he could just go head kick Jordan Burroughs into oblivion and show him that what real fighting is about. Not this one form of fighting where you just have to confine yourself to this one particular rule set. Okay. But then in boxing, it's not like wrestling. You could literally go in there and beat the baddest guy in the world in that particular sport and then say to yourself, you know what? I am now the baddest man in the world with a couple of fights under my belt. Impossible in wrestling. You know how many wrestling matches some of the top level wrestlers have? Now, for me, I've had hundreds of wrestling matches. All you can count them from middle school, maybe even back to elementary school, middle school, all the way to high school. And then some guys that go out there and continue their college careers, they go on to have even more matches. And then after the college careers of wrestling, they go on to do internationals. They go on to try out for the Olympics, and then they go out for try in world tournaments of Greco-Roman or freestyle wrestling. So then they accumulate an amount of literally from the 100 matches that they've had in high school and college or whatever, 200, and then in the pros, or I'm sorry, in the Olympic levels, now you're doing 400 to 500 matches. So this is a proven sport that you can't just go in there and say, you know what, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to dominate Kyle Dake, the 4-division NCAA champion in college wrestling. And then he went to the Olympics, obviously won some gold medals in the 2020s and then won some worlds in the Pan Ams and whatnot. That's Kyle Dake in a nutshell. So you can't do that in wrestling, but you can in boxing. And over again, it's been proven that you can. Because guess what? Logan Paul went in there. You can argue all you want. We seen what we seen. We saw how that match went. Logan Paul won that fight with Mayweather. It's an exhibition. No one's going to count that fight. But how is it that Floyd Mayweather, the TBE, goes in there and gets spanked by Logan Paul? How is it that Francis Ngannou comes in here and is able to beat this generation's best heavyweight? You know what this is like? I'm going to be honest with you. This is literally like Francis Ngannou stealing a DeLorean from the Back to the Future, okay, and then inserting himself into boxing history. Great Scott! What Doc Brown would probably say. Marty, why did you let Francis Ngannou take the car? He has now ruined the boxing's history. That's literally what happened. Francis Ngannou took a DeLorean from 1985 and traveled to 2023 to beat the greatest boxer in this current generation. And not even Biff Tannen in his sports almanac book could have ever even imagined that, or would have even read it in his book, because obviously that particular book was only present within from the 1950s to the 2000. If for all the Back to the Future heads that have watched all of those movies, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, we're not here to discuss 80s movies or anything like that. Now let's discuss some psychological matters that Tyson Fury has going on, because I've explained the technical aspects of Tyson Fury's career and his changes and his lifestyle habits and things of that nature. Now you see why there's a little bit of a decline. Now let's talk about the psychological side of things, right? Tyson Fury is a family man. Not that this is anything wrong, but I got to be honest with you, right? If you are a fighter that is single, as opposed to, let's say, a fighter that has parental responsibilities, now it's just more likely that the fighter who is single or doesn't have anybody to look after is just going to have more time to be meticulous about their training, to be a little bit more rigid, and to cut less corners. Now, obviously, that's anecdotal and it's different for everybody, because there are guys out there like Khabib who have a family structure that is revolved around MMA, to which they are very sympathetic to the time being that he has to take in order to train and recover and things of that nature. Now, with Tyson Fury, you can argue, yes, it's sort of like that with him as well, because he comes from a gypsy family. They all understand the world of prize fighting. They all understand what is at stake and what you need to do in order to prepare. So, because of that, Tyson Fury perhaps has a bit of a better family structure in terms of getting ready for fights. But then at some point, you start realizing that, you know what, you're starting to have kids that are becoming teenagers. Now they're getting involved in other things that perhaps maybe you should involve yourself in, as maybe perhaps being a teenager, you're getting ready to drive a car. Maybe if you are, let's say, a young boy that is, let's say, of a certain age that can compete in combat sports. Because I know Tyson's son, he puts his son through judo and jujitsu schools and whatnot, which is really interesting that he's involving his son in the world of MMA, right? So these are just things that are just going to hold you back just a little bit. Now, not so much, but again, we don't know enough about Tyson Fury's life aside from the Netflix. And by the way, that's another thing that goes into this whole fiasco, is the fact that he is in this situation where now he's a superstar. He's number one in Netflix. When it came out, everybody was watching it. It was like the top five on your list in terms of what to watch, right? So now he's a star in Netflix. He's got all these TV shows like Good Morning Britain that's going to invite him, Pierce Morgan, you name it. He's a media giant now. You got to ask yourself, did all of this go to his head? Now, the problem is, you can say that not really, because you look at the motto and the ethos of the Gypsies. What is it all about? It's all about really being an iconoclastic personality. And what do I mean by iconoclastic? Meaning that you sort of gear away from the mainstream thoughts of society, meaning that these people don't pay mortgages. They live in a trailer. I'm talking about most gypsies. Obviously, Tyson Fury has a big old house that he pays for or has paid off for or whatever, and lives in a very modern accommodation. And you can see that in his Netflix series when he highlights the town that he lives in, which is Morecambe. I believe it's a beach town side in northern England, in the Manchester area. But yeah, that's neither here or there. So he lives a pretty good life. Okay. Now, it is the ethos of the gypsies to live simple and whatnot and live this noble traveler's life that they like to call it. So it's very conducive to becoming a hungry fighter. But the bottom line is, we're all human beings. And when we get a certain amount of wealth, it changes us. And sometimes it doesn't have to, but it'll change us a little bit. Even with Khabib. Khabib is a guy that doesn't allow wealth to change him whatsoever. The guy literally drives a Toyota and he's perfectly okay with it. A Toyota truck. Why? Because guess what? Toyota trucks are some of the best trucks in the world that last for a very long time. But he's getting Mercedes Benzes from Ramzan Kadyrov. He's getting all these different cars from the sheikhs of Dubai and this and that, all these different gifts. Okay, he has it somewhere in a garage, but on his daily basis, where he goes to the markets of Machkala, Dagestan, and whatnot, he's out there driving around in a truck. Why? Because it works, and because it's very useful and conducive to the mountainside environment that he lives in. So it doesn't change his outlook on life being wealthy. Now, having the influence of, let's say, being able to give charity, being able to provide for the fighters that are involved in your camp, and being able to fund them as people that have funded you on your way up to success. Yes, you can do this. This is the one thing that changes. Now, I'm not saying that Tyson Fury doesn't do that, but at the same time, you have to understand that with the addiction that Tyson Fury has faced throughout his entire life and the mental health challenges that he's had, you have to really ask yourself, if he's going to fight in a much longer time than what you would think he would be fighting, right? Because at some point it's got to give. He's even mentioned this. He's even mentioned something to the effect that, you know what? The only reason why I'm going to retire early is because of the bad choices that I had made all throughout my career, at least within the time that he was able to, let's say, capture his championship crown and whatnot, right? So because of that, he feels that at some point he is going to retire. He's going to retire a lot earlier than what he had expected. So that right there is a psychological side of this. I'm going to play you a video with Kamzat, now an Emirati citizen, political and religious implications that I did 4 weeks ago, which is literally a month. This was prior to UFC 284. And what is significant about this is that, well, the Middle East right now, in particular, the Arab Khaliji countries such as the Emirates, the Saudis, and maybe even the Qataris and the Bahrainis, a lot of these guys are now taken over combat sports, and in particular boxing for the Saudis, and in particular MMA for the Emiratis, which is the deal that they have going on with the UFC. I'm going to play you this video, and when I come back, we're going to talk about all the political implications that come with Saudi Arabia being a major player in the world of combat sports, as the Emiratis are a major combat sports player in the world of not just jiu-jitsu, but now MMA, and in particular their partnership with the UFC, and among other among other MMA brands that are going on in the Middle East, such as Bahrain with Brave FC. As you know, Kamzat has fought out there. But check out this video from 4 weeks ago, and I will be right back, and we will talk about the implications of the Saudis in the world of combat sports, both the positives and the negatives, and all the objective truths in between. And we are back once again with another one. This time we're going to talk about Kamzat versus Paulo Costa in the upcoming pay-per-view of UFC 294 live in Abu Dhabi, which is going to be great because if you're watching it in the West Coast like I am, well, guess what? You're going to be able to watch it in the morning time and then have the entire Saturday to yourself, or maybe watch other fights that are going on that day. But not only are we going to talk about Paulo Costa and Kamzat Chimaev in particular, I'm going to talk to you about why the UAE has given Kamzat Chimaev citizenship. And it has a lot to do with being able to fight in America. And of course, it definitely has a lot to do with his friendship with none other than the Chechnyan dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is also, by the way, if you guys are a little bit illiterate in the geopolitical sphere of things, is an ally of Vladimir Putin. I'm going to go into a little bit of history with Ramzan Kadyrov in a little bit and how all it is ties. But as you know, a lot of it has to deal with Ukraine and the conflict going on over there, and the lines that are drawn in the sand with the United States on one side and Russia on the other side, and then with Ukraine being an ally of the United States and Russia right now being a contrasting interest to Western counterparts. So before we go into the kicks and punches, let's talk geopolitics of Paulo Costa and Kamzat Chimaev. So Kamzat Chimaev has been granted citizenship in Abu Dhabi. Now, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that he gets the same rights and privileges as, let's say, a regular, normal Emirati that is born local, native, and has a passport in that particular land? Well, my answer is probably not. And in only by paper, he is an Emirati citizen. And what do I mean by the privileges? Well, maybe perhaps he's not going to be able to buy a building off of an Emirati if he wishes to, if he ever gets to be in that type of level of money where he can just buy buildings, sort of like what Floyd Mayweather does. I think the guy goes out and buys buildings and businesses and whatnot and everything in between. But those are some of the things that he can't do. Another thing that he can't do, he also can't, let's say, run for public office. I mean, they're a monarch, so I don't think that has any, sense of meritocracy and a type of politicians that they let in their particular sphere of government and influence. But nevertheless, he has the same privileges as any other normal Emirati citizen, which is good enough to, guess what, be able to fight in the United States. And why is that significant? Well, for those of you that don't know, the Emiratis have a stake in the UFC, just like the Saudis. As you guys know, the Saudis are fallen into this whole thing. And by the way, I'm going to go into a religious aspect of it too when it comes to, let's say, Islamic prophecies of the end days. I'm going to go into that in a little bit, along with Ramzan Kadyrov and his history. So when you are an Emirati citizen, right, you have the privileges of an American citizen, meaning that you can travel freely in the free world and all its allies and everything that is involved in that sphere of things, i.e. what people call the New World Order. Some may call it the UN for official sake. Some call it the Council of Foreign Relations. All of those things, all correlated in this matter. So Khamzat has been having visa issues coming to the United States to fight. This is why you haven't been able to see him. Why? Because the guy loves the fight. If you guys remember in the pandemic days of the Fight Island Abu Dhabi events, Khamzat was fighting almost every week. And then on top of that, he would want another one and another one. And then eventually the train just started stopping, especially right after the Gilbert Burns fight. And then, of course, after that, he went on to fight Kevin Holland and finish him emphatically within the first round of submission. So after that, we never got to see him since. And perhaps maybe a lot of that has to deal with the effective visa ban and issues that comes with, let's say, Russian citizens. So he says he no longer wants to rep Sweden. Part of the things that he says is because they are a highly socialist country to the point where they do tax you heavily. And if you're a UFC star and a sportsman like Khamzat Chimaev, you would imagine the level of pay that you would have to give up to the Swedish government as a Swedish citizen and as a resident. So it was a multitude of reasons as to why they chose to give Khamzat this particular opportunity. So now that the UFC, and I was going back to the Emirati about they have a stake in the UFC, right? So the fact that the Emiratis have a stake in the UFC, that means that they want Khamzat to be able to fight even outside of the Emirates, which means that, let's say, if he gets to have a title fight, which is on the horizon, eventually it's going to happen. It's either going to be with Sean Strickland, or it's either going to be with Israel Adesanya, or anybody that is up there in the 185 division, maybe even with Dricus du Plessis. Now imagine how great that would be, right? But then imagine if they had to put the fight in South Africa and maybe they have affiliations with America and not with Russia, and perhaps that would have been an issue. So now they just alleviated a lot of these things through Khamzat Chimaev having citizenship. Okay, so now that I explained to you why it's important for Khamzat Chimaev to have citizenship with the Emiratis and how that's going to help him get fights in the United States and venues such as Las Vegas, Chicago, New York, Miami, Los Angeles, all the top cities where you want to hold fight events, but especially in Vegas, right? Which, as we know, is the capital of the fight world in America in particular. Okay, so now that we understand and establish that, let's talk about who Ramzan Kadyrov is. Why is he such a bad guy? And why does he constantly post Instagram pictures of him and Khamzat, sparring with Khamzat, making it look like that he beats Khamzat up, when in reality, it's just Khamzat perhaps maybe fearing for his life? And how does this relate to, let's say, the Wagner Group, the guy that got killed recently in a plane crash, the leader of the Wagner Group called the chef, Prajonsky or something like that, his name is. So Ramzan Kadyrov was part of the Chechen resistance movement back in the 90s, him and his father, and the 90s to the 2000s. He was a former jihadist who eventually became partners with Russia. And then after he became partners with Russia, he was given what you would call in a very similar position as what governors would, let's say, take in a certain region of the United States, right? In that type of position, but in a Russian way. So basically, he is the Russian Muslim president, because obviously Russia is a predominantly Christian Orthodox country ran by Vladimir Putin. So as a result, they do have a Muslim population that live in the Caucasus areas, in the Caucasus Mountains, in the Dagestani parts of Russia, in the Chechen parts of Russia, in the stands that are all over the place, right? Which Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all these former Soviet states that have a Muslim heritage behind them. Ramzan Kadyrov is damn near the leader and the commander of that particular region, appointed by none other than Vladimir Putin. This was as far back as 2004 when he was very young. So that's basically who Ramzan Kadyrov is. And now he has this reputation of, let's say, throwing certain people off rooftops. Let's just say people that side with the Jesse Smollett and the Elton Johns of the world, and how I can say it so lightly, right? He throws them off the roof. He goes out and kills dissidents, according to news. Now, I don't know if I can verify that, if that's real or not, but this is what they say. But nonetheless, this is a problem and a controversy when Ramzan Kadyrov is friends with many fighters, a lot of Chechen fighters that fight in the UFC and even in boxing with the likes of Arthur Beterbiev. So this is a very influential man. He loves MMA, he loves combat sports, and he loves all these guys that come from his country to dominate in that sport. And it's a great way for them to create a propaganda for their military, which literally is what everybody does and uses MMA for. Because let's face it, what is MMA? MMA is an entertainment spectacle sport, but it is also a sport that helps promote national defense. And in particular, whether it would be in the United States or Russia or elsewhere in the world. So that's Ramzan Kadyrov in a nutshell. Now, how does this relate with, let's say, the Russians and the Saudis? Well, right now, the Saudis are becoming friends and really cozy with the Russians because for whatever reason, the United States and Saudi Arabia has a little bit of their rift going on, and some may blame the Biden administration for that. A lot of people say that under Trump, the Saudis and the Americans had a good relationship. Of course, you know documentedly well about the relationship with George Bush and none other than the Saudis and their families and how they tie into the whole fiasco and a conspiracy of 9/11. Not that I'm saying that any of that is true or anything to that extent, but these are the correlations and connections to these things. So now the Saudis, as you know, is also getting into the sports business, just like the Emiratis, but doing it on a bigger scale. If you notice, the Saudis went out and basically bought all the best soccer players in the world, created their own golf league that is rival to the PGA, probably even has more budget than them, puts their foot into Formula One racing, puts their hold into boxing, and the likes that you've seen right now with the Tyson Fury fights, with the Francis Ngannou, and even far back as when you had the Super 6 series. If you guys remember when Callum Smith won the 168-pound championship in the Super 6 series that was held in Saudi Arabia, where he fought, I believe, George Groves for the finals. And then, lo and behold, they go and probably try to get into MMA as well, which is, well, there's only one conglomerate giant in the MMA world right now, and obviously that's the UFC, right? Well, the Saudis, don't be surprised if the Saudis will either do business with the UFC in the United States, or they will try to rival them, but I don't see that happen. So, by the way, that was done 4 weeks ago, and full disclosure, what's really important to understand about that is now the Saudis have literally just signed a deal with the UFC to do a show in March. So somewhere in the neighborhood of near UFC 300 or just right before UFC 300, they are going to do a pay-per-view in Saudi Arabia, and my guess is probably something to the extent of a pay-per-view, probably a championship matchup. Maybe not one of those big championship matchups. Maybe they're going to have Pantoja in there, or for all we know, maybe Islam Makhachev. Who knows? Imagine that. Imagine if Leon Edwards gets through Colby Covington, or if Colby Covington gets through Leon Edwards, and then obviously Islam is going to be that particular fight, right? And where are they going to hold it at? Probably in Saudi Arabia. So just thought I'd throw that in. I will be right back. I just wanted to throw that in to add to the content, and I will continue and play the rest of this video, and then we will go on with our discussion about Saudi Arabia as a big player in the world of professional sports and combat sports altogether. Because of the amount of resources that they can have to literally wipe out the UFC if they wish. So what I think is going to happen is perhaps maybe Dana White is going to try to cozy up with the Saudis just as much as he cozies up with the Emiratis, and tries to build a relationship there, because guess what? There's one thing that you got to learn about business, right? And I've heard this from the YouTuber Jesse on Fire, who, by the way, constantly shouts me out in his shows, reads all my comments every time that I'm there. He says something to the effect that you cannot have enemies in business. It's not conducive to your gains that you're trying to make in the business world, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So therefore, he feels that this is not the right path. And I believe that any smart businessman such as Dana White would probably take the same decision in terms of whether they want to make enemies with the Saudis or not. And what's the proof of this? You look at the Francis Ngannou fight, they're not even opposing that. They're not talking down on it, because usually if Dana White sees a fighter that gets out of a contract, he will usually go and slag this person off online or whatever interviews that he can find to basically diminish this person and their product, i.e. Oscar De La Hoya or Frank Shamrock or Randy Couture, all these different interactions that he's had in his business career with the UFC. So, yes, I truly believe that that is the next course of action they're going to take with the Saudis, because they can't let the Saudis take over MMA. And guess what? If you can't beat them, join them. So why would the UFC, or I'm sorry, why would the Saudi Arabia not want to work with a UFC, a proven entity, a top name in the industry, and they can just go and add on to the investments that the Emiratis, that the Endeavor Management Group has, and all the other people in Hollywood that have invested their money into this company known as the UFC, Zuffa, and Endeavor. So, speaking of the Saudis and Emiratis, I'm going to leave it off with this. I remember something to the effect of reading the Hadith saying that in the end days won't come until the Arabs start competing with each other for the highest buildings. And guess what? When you look at the Emiratis, when you look at the Bahrainis, when you look at the Qataris, when you look at the Saudis, you look at all the people that are part of the Khaliji Arab tribe of the world, guess what they're all doing? They all have oil money, and they're competing with each other for the highest buildings in the world. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, once said that this is a sign of the end days. Of course, so all my other Christian and Jewish counterparts out there that understand about prophecies and the end times, I think you know where I'm going with this. But it's just interesting to know that that was documented. And not only are the Saudis and the Emiratis and all the other Arabs competing with each other for the highest buildings, they're also competing with each other, or maybe even working with each other to build the biggest sports network that they can possibly make in various disciplines. All right. So if you guys want to check out the rest of that video, check out Kamzat, now an Emirati citizen, political and religious implications. So yeah, I definitely go into a lot of religious implications, and that obviously Right now, the Saudis and the Emiratis and all the other Khaliji Arab tribes are competing with each other for the highest buildings in the world, but also competing for some of the top sports programs that the world can offer. And if you're interested in it, I urge you guys to research that because you will find some very interesting things that are going on in the modern times today as it relates to prophecies that was made 1,445 years ago. So now let's talk about the Saudis and their implications to the fight world. Now, you're dealing with a government and literally an entertainment company all rolled into one with almost unlimited budget. Now, how is it that they were able to afford all of this? Well, obviously, it's no secret that the world knows all of the world's resources come out of the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia is a big player in that particular field. Not only that, they hold what you would call as the title of the custodians or the janitors of the holy mosque, and that being the leaders of that country, which, by the way, I think is a very humbling name, considering that you have all this wealth, money, power, and influence, and yet you have the title as the janitor of the holy mosque, right? Which, by the way, is a big attraction to a lot of people that come and perform Hajj every year. So you would imagine the amount of money that Saudi Arabia gets from not only Hajj, but also now the tourism on top of the entertainment side of things, right? So this is something to consider about their particular population and their country's economy moving forward. On top of that, they're also out there building new cities in terms of creating like a smart city where everything is Wi-Fi and everything is technologically advanced. And they're planning on doing that in the middle of patches of desert and then planning on growing crops and trees surrounding a place that is literally just nothing but sand, but somehow create this ecological mess of topsy turvy situation in their little landscape that they're building around their tourism. So all of that is now added into fighting, into basically becoming the new Vegas of the Middle East. But obviously, without the gambling aspect of it, because I don't think there's any casinos in Saudi Arabia or any Muslim country for that matter. But if there is, probably on an underground scale, but that's neither here or there. So now, one of the biggest complaints a lot of boxing has had over the years is that the big fights just weren't made enough. Now, what about the Saudis, right? Why didn't they, let's say, do this in 2015 when they had Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather having all these disputes about whether they should fight, when they should fight, in a contract negotiations in between? Why didn't any of them step in? Well, for one, I don't know, but my only speculation is that if you remember when Mohammed bin Salman came into power, he started doing what you would call a house cleaning sweep of some sort. And what do I mean by that exactly? He took on all these guys that were corrupt, that were taking money or somehow had ties to terrorism in any kind of way, rounded them all up, threw them into a hotel, and basically held trial on what they were going to do with each of them individually, whether some of them were going to spend time in jail or whether some of them had to pay some kind of compensation or some of them had to pay their debt to society in whatever crime they committed. Either way, they went and swept the house clean, which is what the Saudis did, right? And then you can look back when Osama bin Laden was living in Saudi Arabia, right? Afterwards, he became somewhat of a dissident, became who he was as what we know the world history to be. And lo and behold, after he left Saudi Arabia, it was as if Saudi Arabia made a U turn for the worse. It became one of the most violent countries in the world Not talking about 2023. I'm talking about the 90s Saudi Arabia. Why was it violent? Because of the fact that there were clashes with Al Qaeda and the local police forces and things of that nature. So it became one day just one of the most safest countries in the world in the 80s and 90s. And then in comes Al Qaeda. It became somewhat of a war zone between rebels and government factions going at it. So they had to clean sweep at some sort. Now they are at a place where, if you remember, Mohammed bin Salman bought guns and ammunitions and military hardware from none other than Mr. 45 himself, Donald J. Trump. Okay. And even Donald Trump sort of joked with Mohammed bin Salman, saying, you know what? I should have charged you more. I should have charged you more for these weapons. So guess what? They have all those weapons now. And you can make an argument about some of the mishaps and mistakes they have made in Yemen. That's certainly granted. But you can not deny that Saudi is a military powerhouse in terms of the security that they can now offer to that country. So, in other words, they definitely put all those weapons that they had bought to good use. Now that they did that, now they're able to bring in all these celebrities that you've seen come in during the fight week of Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury. Guess what? That place was heavily secured with military, with special forces, with local police and SWAT teams that are all armed to the teeth that they have bought from America. So now they're able to offer the world safety in ways that they never were able to back in the days because of these particular factors. So now that, let's say, they swept clean their house, and not only that, they were able to keep the country safe. And not only that, the Saudis, in terms of keeping the country safe, now they're able to bring in all this tourism and continue all these big fights that they want to happen in their region and create this new imaginary Disneyland, Universal Studios theme park of a thing that they have going on over there. And now they're able to attract the world in ways that we would have never imagined before. So this is why we are where we're at. So let's recap on a couple of things here, if you're just listening, right? Number one, the Saudis at one point was a safe country in the 80s and 90s. In comes Osama bin Laden. He joins Al Qaeda or created Al Qaeda, or however you want to verify that story. He then goes into Afghanistan and then recruits a bunch of Saudis to follow him in that particular way, and then gets into clashes with government forces then in the 90s and into the war on terror era of the early 2000s. Saudi Arabia became a very unsafe place until years later down the road, Mohammed bin Salman and his father come into power, and they started cleaning the house in Saudi Arabia, getting rid of the corruption, all the people that were funding terrorism and whatnot. And then it made it into a much safer country to create all of these things to be as possible as they are right now. And then the weapons that they had bought from America during Donald J. Trump's presidency is the reason why they are heavily secured as they are now. So this is what you have with Saudi Arabia in a nutshell. And by the way, guys, I want to thank you for coming and listening to Tyson Fury, to this particular content of analyzing whether Tyson Fury is finished or not. And I'm giving you the here's why. Also, the technical and psychological breakdown. And how about this? The upcoming fights that we have going on for the UFC. Before I go, let's talk about the upcoming fights that they have for the UFC. Obviously, there was no fights for the UFC on October the 28th because they wanted to reserve that night for none other than Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury. So in this coming week, this Saturday, speaking of heavyweights, we got a real treat of a banger when it comes to heavyweight fighting, right? So here we have Jailton Almeida taking on Derek Lewis. Now, what's interesting about this, after coming off of a week from Tyson Fury and Francis Ngannou, Derek Lewis is one of the most boring fights that Francis Ngannou has ever been in. And by the way, he lost that by a decision, rightfully so. Another decision that he had lost. So here we are with Jailton Almeida. What's interesting about this guy, I would consider him as almost like the Alexander Usyk of MMA. Why? Because he's a real life cruiserweight who is moving up to fight at heavyweight. Look at this. They got him stacked as 205. I don't think he weighs that little, maybe 210 at most, but still, he's a small heavyweight fighting these big heavyweights. And he's able to do it based on the skills that he's able to apply towards these guys. Co-main event, you got the undefeated 15-0 Gabriel Bonfim taking on Nicholas Dalby. That's going to be a good one. Rogério Montesino Ferreira taking on Dontel Mays. What else is in this card? Caio Borla taking on Abus Magomedov. How about that? Coming back after his Sean Strickland loss. This is going to be very interesting how he bounces back from this. He obviously has the height advantage in this particular fight. Let's see if he can bounce back against Caio here from his loss from none other than Sean Strickland, which, by the way, doesn't seem like a very bad loss in the long term, does it? Considering the fact that Sean Strickland is now champion. Rodolfo Vieira, the former Jiu-Jitsu world champion, taking on Armin Petrosian. That's going to be a good one. These are good middleweight fights right here. And in the lightweight division, Ismael Bonfim, along with his brother, on the same card, taking on Vince Pichel at the 155 division. How about this? Curtis Blades is supposed to be in this fight. He got canceled, but then in comes Derek Lewis. Elvis Brenner taking on Esteban Revokic. Victor Hugo taking on Daniel Marcos. Dos Santos taking on Renat Fariganov. Victor Petrino taking on Modestas Bukakis. How about that? The former Cage Rage champion coming back. How about that win that he had against Tyson Pedro? He was literally out of the UFC, came back into the world of Cage Warriors, right? Went and won a title in Cage Warriors and then came back and beat Tyson Pedro on a short notice because he was needed. How about this? Angela Hill taking on Denise Gomez. Lucas Alexander taking on David Onama. And then Eduardo Mora taking on Musrat Ruiz. That's going to be a good one. And the first fight is Mark Diakase. How about this? Mark Diakase taken all the way down the list with a guy that doesn't even have a Wikipedia. So that's the fights that they have coming for this weekend. And then after that, obviously, you have, which is now official, Jiri Prochazka taking on Alex Pereira. Now, that fight right there, I think that I'll make an official prediction for these cards right now. How about it? Since we have some people coming in, I'm just going to do some official predictions for UFC 295 and maybe do some predictions for Almeida versus Lewis. So with Jiri Prochazka and Alex Pereira, how do I see this fight? I think Alex Pereira is going to be a lot more technical in this fight. He's going to make the least mistakes. Jiri Prochazka makes a lot of mistakes because he's very wild and unorthodox in the way that he fights, but doesn't know how to really be unorthodox and be defensively sound at the same time. At some point, Alex Pereira is going to clip him. And not only that, I could also see Alex Pereira out wrestling him, which, by the way, I could see this go into a 5-round decision for Alex Pereira just based on that. Sergey Pavlovich taking on Tom Aspinall. Wow, what can you really say? Sergey has only had one loss, which was to who? None other than Alistair Overeem. So that loss doesn't really tell us much. He was very early into his career, and Sergey is a kind of fighter that is a do or die, meaning that once you go in there, he's going to swing bombs at you, and he's either going to be bombed at or you're going to be bombed. But more than likely, he is the one that's doing the bombing because guess what? He's 18-1, and one of those wrong bombs that got countered was none other than Alistair Overeem, who, by the way, is just way past his prime now. Now, Tom Aspinall, he is a much more well-rounded fighter, which, by the way, I could see him fight very careful in this fight. I could also see him take down Sergey Pavlovich just based on the fact that he is the better wrestler, the better grappler. And Sergey's going to be very hard to finish. So I'm going to lean with Tom Aspinall either by a decision or late round submission, probably somewhere in the championship rounds of 4 or 5. So I'm going with Tom Aspinall on that one. Diego Lopez taking on uh, Sabatini. Not much of a big names for the main card. Jessica Andrade versus Mackenzie Dern. That's a big one. Matt Pravola taking on Benoit Saint Denis. How do I see this with Diego Lopez and Pat Bezzettini? So, what do we know about Diego Lopez? 26-2 is Diego Lopez, right? Let's take a look at his profile in Sherdog. By the way, Sherdog is one of the most trusted mixed martial arts websites of all time. All the old school guys know exactly what I'm talking about. So here it is. His pro fight, he's had a loss against Movar Evlevov by Movzavar Evlevov by a decision. Okay. And then after that, he had a split decision against Nate Robinson, lost at a technical decision. So this is a guy that's very difficult to finish. Other than, yeah, he was finished in the ACB back in Russia. What else was his other losses? So what are some of his wins? He's got a lot of submission wins. His last win was a submission by an armbar against Gavin Tucker, right? Not an easy fight. That was all the way back in August. And then let's take a look at, let's see here, a second. Okay, so uh, Pat Sabatini, let's take a look at him, right? Let's take a look at what this guy is about right here. Pat Sabatini, also another guy that doesn't have any particular Wikipedia of any kind, so not a very big card in terms of name values and whatnot. But once again, not to be underestimated, this could be an absolute banger of a thing, you know. So his last fight was against Lucas Almeida by submission. So okay, we're gonna have two guys here that have very good proficient submission skills, right? I can't see any of these guys um sort of putting each other in a finishing hold of any kind, right? I don't see any of these guys finishing each other with a submission. I'm gonna go with Diego Lopez by a decision on this one. Jessica Andrade versus Mackenzie Dern. I'm going to go with Mackenzie Dern. She just looks like more of the technical fighter, right? Has a lot of improved striking. I think that she's going to be able to nullify anything that she does on her feet. So, yeah, that's going to be a decision for Mackenzie Dern. Benoit Saint Denis, this is a guy that's very difficult to finish. Matt Pravola loves to go in there and bang. I could see Benoit Saint Denis getting a decision on this one just based on the fact that he is the much more improved fighter, the guy that has taken his licks in terms of getting in there in scrappy positions, but also improving a very new and evolving technical game, along with knowing how to brawl when he needs to. So something to look out for. Josh Van taking on Kevin Borjas. I don't know much about these guys. Yeah, 8-1. That's good. Okay, versus 9-1. And then Jared Gordon, how about that? Taking on Mark Madison. I'm going to go with Jared Gordon on that one, just based on his performance that he had against Patty. I was really impressed with his performance against Patty. That's going to be a good one. Dennis Bajuka taking on Jamal Emmers. Not too many guys that I know of. Tabitha Ritchie taking on Lapita Goodness. I'm going to go with Tabitha Ritchie on that one by decision. Nazim Zadekov taking on Borichez at the lightweight division. Okay, and then Matthew Schnell. Okay, I do know who that guy is. Okay, yeah, taking on Erzeg. Mateus Rebecki taking on Nurullo Aliyev, 9-0. Okay, that's good. All right, these are good fights with guys with good records taking on each other, right? So I'm sure a lot of these fights are going to be 50-50. Now let's go a week back. Let's take a look at some fights from the Almeida fight. So yeah, I went over some of these fights already. Rodolfo Vieira, I could see that one going to a submission on his part. With Jailton Almeida, I'm going to be honest with you, I see him submitting Derek Lewis in this one, right? The minute that he takes down Derek Lewis is not going to know when to get up, right? Just like what Daniel Cormier did to him at UFC 230, which, by the way, was a New York card back in 2018. I could literally see him do that to Derek Lewis as well. So yeah, that's it. That's all the fights that we have for the upcoming weeks. What else is after UFC 295? I believe you have Brandon Allen taking on Paul Craig. That's going to be a fun fight. Michael Moraes, Jake Matthews back in the mix. Chase Hooper taking on Jordan Levitt. Okay, the saucy Jordan Levitt. Peyton Talbot taking on Nick Aguiar. Okay. Amanda Ribas back in the mix against Luana. Johnny Parsons taking on Euros Medic. And who else is in the preliminary cards of this one in November 18th? Jonathan Pierce, all right, against Brito. Chad versus Jose Johnson. Cesar Almeida. Christian Leroy Duncan. This one I'm interested in right here. Christian Leroy Duncan, I believe, is a former middleweight champion of Cage Warriors. So they got a lot of interesting guys that they funnel up from that particular system of the Cage Warriors system. Patty the Batty was from there. Obviously, Conor McGregor. Then you have Bukakis, who I just mentioned earlier, part of that mix as well. So this is going to be really interesting. I believe Christian Duncan Leroy was coming off of a loss by a decision against Armin Petrosian. No shame in that. That was a really, really tough guy, right? And then he came in and took on Dusko Torovic, got a knockout back in UFC 286. So this is a guy to look out for. This is going to be really interesting how he bounces back from that decision loss. Okay, and then who else we have here? Christian Leroy Duncan. Okay, Mick Parton in the heavyweight division. I believe this is a guy that trains with Tom Aspinall, one of the heavyweights that Tom Aspinall trains with. So this is going to be really interesting. By the way, the reason why I picked Tom Aspinall to win that fight in New York against Sergey is because I believe this time he has now proper training partners to really get him ready for these heavyweights, which I think is really important for you guys to understand, right? Because the way Tom Aspinall used to train, he trained with smaller guys. Now, granted, this helped a lot with his speed, but in order to understand the level of damage, the level of pain that these heavyweights bring, you got to bring in other heavyweights. This is a guy that he's brought in his camp, Mickey Parkin, right? 7-0, 6'3", 265 pounds, a real legit heavyweight. So I'm going to be very interested to see his fight against Caio Machado in this one. Now, what do we know about Caio Machado right here? Let's go to his Tapology page. His name is also the Bigfoot, which is quite interesting, right? Because there is Bigfoot Silva, 6'4". How old is this guy? He is 29 years old. Let's see. He is number 1 in Western Canada amongst pro heavyweights. So this is what's really interesting about Tapology, right? We know the rankings in the UFC, and sometimes you know the rankings of overall MMA, but this is the one beautiful thing about Tapology. They really tell you where these guys are at on the regional scene. Now, he is number 1 in Canada and number 1 in Western Canada, right? Who would have thought? So again, it's important to look at these things because once you bring these guys into the world stage, then you're not going to be surprised if they go in there and steamroll some of these guys. Because if you look at their stats, I mean, they are what, number one in their country. So if you're number one in your country, wouldn't you say that you have a great chance of, let's say, being one of the top guys in the world? So something to look at here. The only loss, what is the only loss that this guy has had? I don't think he's lost yet, or does he? It doesn't say any of his losses here. Okay, his loss was a decision against Dustin Johnson, an unknown guy. Okay, very early in his career. So, in other words, you're dealing with two heavyweights here that are going to be very difficult to finish, right? And what are some things that I've seen out of Parkin during his fight? Some of the things I've noticed about this guy, right? Mick Parkin is he fights very slow and methodical, right? So he also fights very careful. Now that may look boring to, let's say, the average fan out there, but one thing you got to understand is that sometimes boring wins fights, and boring sometimes gives you the safety within your fight. So something to think about. So what else is in this particular card? Let's go back to the November 18th card, the Brendan Allen, Paul Craig card. So how do I see Paul Craig versus Brendan Allen? Boy, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to go with Paul Craig by a submission. I just think that Brendan Allen is susceptible to making mistakes, and I think that Paul Craig is just a high-level jiu-jitsu operator, and on top of that, he's going to be very big for this weight class. So the size, the skills, the experience, and the prowess on the grappling side is just going to be on the side of Paul Craig. Now, obviously, these two guys are not that much bigger than the other. You look at the size, virtually identical. Obviously, Paul Craig a little bit older, but because of that experience, I think he's just going to out-grapple Brendan Allen on this one. So Chase Hooper versus Jordan Levitt, that's going to be a good one at 155, right? Jordan Levitt obviously is a very, very athletic and very acrobatic type of striker. I wonder how that's going to match up with Chase Hooper with his ever-evolving striking and great submission skills that he can display with this one. But I think I'm going to go with Jordan Levitt on that one by decision. So moving on to the other cards here. Okay, you got Charles Johnson, Rafael Estem, undefeated. So he's going to be the first fight of the card. I like this. They always bring these undefeated guys as their first fight. You look at what they had with Sharaputin Magomedov. He was the first fight. He was undefeated, 11-0 going into that card. Nicholas Moda taking on Trey Ogden. Lucy Pudilova taking on Alan Perez. Jekka Sareg taking on Jesse Butler. And then after that, you have UFC 296, which is in December. So let's take a look at that card right there. That's going to be a banger of a card right here. Let's take a look at this. Leon Edwards, obviously, against Colby Covington, the long-awaited title shot that Colby Covington has been looking for, his third title shot at that. By the way, a little storyline on this fight, right? Obviously, there was this assault that had happened to Colby Covington as a result of him running his mouth and Jorge Masvidal coming in there at a steakhouse and giving it to him, sucker punched him. I mean, look, whether you think that's right or wrong, let's just be honest, it's a sucker punch either way. But he was going to sue Jorge Masvidal. For some reason, that lawsuit dropped. And my assumption is maybe there were some negotiations under the table that had gone on, something to the extent of, well, you know what, maybe you should drop your charges towards Colby Covington should drop his charges towards Jorge Masvidal. And if you do this, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to give you a title shot. And here we are. Leon Edwards, right, has now defeated Kamaru Usman twice. What was considered the number one pound-for-pound fighter of all time. Now Leon Edwards has that title around his strap, taking on Colby Covington. And Brandon Royval taking on Alexander Pantoja. How about that big win from Alexander Pantoja back in the summer of UFC 290 in Las Vegas? He came on the mic. He mentioned something to the effect of how his father didn't want him anymore, or this and that, or this sad story that he had. It was just great seeing him win against Brandon Moreno after that. Well, now here he comes back and defends his title against Brandon Royval. Now, how about this? A great way to end a pay-per-view of the entire year. Shavkat Rakhmonov taking on Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. 17-0, taking on Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, the veteran, 17-6-1 in his career, which is going to be a great striking matchup. But you could imagine that Shavkat is going to impose some sort of wrestling to nullify Stephen Wonderboy Thompson in this particular matchup. Now, Tony Ferguson taking on Paddy Pimblett. A lot of people were very skeptical about this fight. And not only that, really did not like this fight whatsoever. And I can't blame them. But at the same time, I can blame them because let's be honest. You look at Paddy the Baddy, his last performance, right? Now you look at Tony Ferguson and his last performance. What commission, athletic commission in the entire world would not allow this fight to happen? It's literally dead even. Here's a guy who is a skilled prospect, maybe not yet world level. And then here's a guy who was world level, but is falling under the cracks of these guys that are world level world beaters. If anything, here's a hot take on this, right? If anything, this is a mismatch for Paddy the Baddy Pimblett. But the reason why we don't look at it as a mismatch is because Tony Ferguson seems like damaged goods only because he got damaged really good by guys that are really good that could damage. I'm going to have to replay that particular part of this content to re-listen to that particular part because I don't think I could ever say what I just said again. But you get what I mean. Rewind back a few 15 seconds behind it, see what I'm talking about. Yes, that is literally the quintessential understanding of this entire matchup, which literally makes it even. Now, if Paddy is able to beat Tony Ferguson, then we still have questions because we don't know if Paddy can really hang with those guys at the top world levels or the contender levels or even the championship levels. But Tony Ferguson is the next step above to finding that out, and a very slow one at that. With Tony Ferguson, let's say if he was to beat Paddy the Baddy, this would make him a hero in more ways than one. Why? Because number one, let's just be honest. A lot of people who are not from Liverpool are just not big fans of Paddy. And then he just rubs people the wrong way because of what had happened in the Jared Gordon fight. A lot of people really thought Jared Gordon won that fight. And on top of that, people got to know Jared Gordon through social media and fell in love with him in a way that they want to see him do good. So, yes, Paddy rubs people the wrong way. So it would be very satisfying for a lot of the hardcore MMA heads or these, what do you call it? These MMA fans that love to hang out in MMA chats and, MMA groups on Facebook. And it would really make them happy for Tony Ferguson to take out Paddy the Baddy. But it would also show that the only reason why Tony had all these losses is because he was fighting guys at the highest world level that you can find. So that's going to be an interesting matchup. Now, how about Ian Gary taking on Vicente Luque? What's interesting about this match? You're moving Ian Gary right on up because of his latest performance that he had against Daniel Rodriguez, his latest performance that he had against Neil Magny. You have no choice but to put him up against the next gatekeeper, which is Vicente Luque, a guy who can really bring the violence, really bring like a Vanderlei Silva type of fight, but at the same time be as exciting as Justin Gaethje. And in here you have Ian Gary, who has proven to be a very technical striker. On top of that, has proven to be very well-rounded. 25 years old, is literally just moving up the ladder in terms of these accumulations that he's had, right? His first UFC fight, let's take a look at where his first UFC fight, because I'm sure it was on a pay-per-view of some sort, right? So let's take a look at Ian Gary's entire future, right? Because he is nicknamed the Future. 13 wins, no losses. Next fight against Vicente Luque. So obviously, another Cage Warriors veteran, right? He entered Colby Covington versus Usman 2 in a debut against Jordan Williams. And by the way, that was, I'm not sure that was a main card, but it was a pay-per-view. See, all these fights that he's had, it's all on pay-per-view, except for the Daniel Rodriguez fight, right? The Song fight 285 was a pay-per-view. Gabriel Green was a pay-per-view. UFC 273 was a pay-per-view. Jordan Williams was a pay-per-view in his first fight. Then Daniel Rodriguez, I believe he was a headliner for that one. And then back to pay per view again back in August in Boston, right? So a big step for Ian Machado Gary here, right? So what else is in this particular card? Let's take a look at the rest of UFC 296 because that is the last card of the entire year. So Alex Pantoja, we talked about that one. Casey O'Neill taking on Ariana Lipsky. That's going to be a good one. An upcoming women's flyweight contender. Josh Emmett versus Giga Chad, right? Giga Chikadze, or as people like to call him, Giga Chad, or was it the young kids like to call Giga Chads nowadays? So Irene Aldana is in that against Carol Rosa. So this one I'm particularly excited about. Josh Emmett, our very own Sacramento born and raised and bred and all Sacramento Josh Emmett, right? He was raised out here, trained out here, because guess what? A lot of the guys that come out here in Sacramento, they're not from here. Cody Garbrandt was never from Sacramento. Chad Mendez was never from Sacramento. Yes, he was from Hanford, California, which is somewhere in the central side of California, right? Santa Barbara for TJ Dillashaw. Even Uriah Faber is not really from here. He's from a town called Lincoln, right? So most of the Sacramento guys that train out here in Team Alpha Male, they're not real Sacramento guys. Unlike Josh Emmett, he's a real Sacramento guy. Born and raised and bred in the Team Alpha Male system, now taking on this world-class striker in Giga Chikadze at the 145 division, right? So I could see this matchup going well for Josh Emmett if he is able to take down Giga Chikadze. Now, Giga is going to plan on striking because guess what? That's his bread and butter. He's a former Glory contender champion and Muay Thai kickboxing champion and whatnot. So that's just what he's going to do. Josh Emmett has to try and nullify him with the takedowns and keep him down. And guess what? Josh Emmett has the wrestling grind to be able to do that. How about this? Alonzo Menefield taking on Dustin Jacoby at the 205 division. Martin Buday taking on Shamil Gaziev, 11-0 at the heavyweight division. Randy Brown, here's a good matchup. There's going to be some real good striking in this one. Randy Brown taking on Muslim Salikov. Now, that's going to be an awesome banger of a card right there because Muslim Salikov is a kung fu fighter, right? Not only is he a kung fu fighter, he also knows how to strike in a very dynamic way, in ways that may confuse Randy Brown because of his Sun Shu style. But I could also see Randy Brown try to implement a lot of his jabs in this particular fight and try to use his distance. But I just feel like Muslim Salikov, with the explosive in and out movements that he does with his shots, may be a problem for Randy Brown in this one. Now, Tagir Ulanbekov taking on Cody Durden. Now, Cody Durden fought Muhammad Makayev on his way up, seems to be now taking on the role of a gatekeeper in these divisions. And then how about this? This is a great matchup. Speaking of Cody Garbrandt, one of Sacramento's own. Well, not exactly one of Sacramento's own, as I had mentioned earlier. Now taking on Brian Kelleher, right? 37 years old. Cody Garbrandt, 32 years old, reaching into his prime years. Maybe not so at the 135 division, at least not so much for Brian Kelleher. I could see Cody Garbrandt getting a decision on this one only because he's going to try to fight very carefully, try to get his feet wet in this particular division. And I think Brian Kelleher is going to be very hard to finish. Cody Garbrandt is going to know and understand that as the fight goes on. But we will see, man. This is basically the last fight of 2024, right? I'm sorry, 2023. Now, before I leave, I want to play you guys a video. I'm going to leave off with this, right? I'm going to leave off with the video that I made about a couple of months ago. I believe I called it 2023, the best year for combat sports. Let me see if I can find this here, and I'm going to play it for you guys as my little exit of some way. 2023, the best year of combat sports. So, yeah, because basically I just went through the entire UFC card of 2023. And let's see here. Where did I have this? Did I have, hold on a second. Let's go through my catalog right here so you see what I'm looking at. Hmm. Here it is, right here. 2023, the greatest year in combat sports. So I'm going to play this video for you just so you can kind of get into context of understanding why I was so big on this particular year. And by the way, the many years to come, I'm going to finish it off with this. I'm going to come back and finish off the stream. But for now, yeah, watch this and I will be right back and continue on with the stream. Do we Oh my goodness. You can't tell me 2023 wasn't the best years of all time when it comes to combat sports. Now, we're talking about with boxing both and in MMA. Talk about the fact that you had Ryan Garcia taking on Tank Davis. And a couple of years ago, that seemed very unlikely to happen. And then it finally did. And then you had the likes of, let's say, Terrence Crawford finally fighting Spence 5 years later, but nonetheless, it was still done and it happened to have landed right here on 2023. The best year of combat sports. Of course, a couple of things got away. For example, John Jones and Francis Ngannou got away from us because of the contract negotiations that had to happen with Francis and his disagreements with the UFC while he was champion. He then moves on with his career. Now he's taken on Tyson Fury in Saudi Arabia by the Skills Challenge promotion granted and provided by the Saudi royal government. And now he's going to get paid in ways that he never got paid in the mixed martial arts game. In the UFC, they weren't willing to pay him the way that he's going to get paid with Tyson Fury. So that fight never unfolded. And then John Jones, he became the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, winning his second world championship in his second weight class. And now taking on one of the best heavyweights of all time, none other than Stipe Miocic, in which is going to solidify him as a heavyweight and as an undisputed champion in the division without having to fight Francis. But nonetheless, it's a fight that got away in 2023. Also, Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler. We saw them at the Ultimate Fighter. Very amazing in the way that it was produced, right? Because let's just face it, not really amazing in the way that it was produced. They were doing the same thing that they were doing from 2005 and then right on the same time right now. It's really no different. There was no changes. There was no evolution. It was the same formula. Sure, they used 4K camera in ways that they never used in the mid 2000s, but nonetheless, it was still a lackluster show, but it made up with the drama of Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler clashing with each other. Not only did it make up for that, McGregor had this losing streak going on as a coach, and a lot of people were questioning about his I guess, ability to coach. But then how can you really judge something to that effect when you're dealing with a situation where you're fighting guys within 1 week and you're not really training them for a training camp? You've never been in a gym with these guys for no more than a couple of days. So how much can you really stem off from that, and how much can you really teach or evolve a fighter from that situation? And not to mention, the theme of the entire season was based on veterans versus upcoming prospects. And a lot of these veterans were already UFC vets that have had some lackluster UFC fights, or maybe they just constantly went to a decision, or maybe they got finished a few times by top level guys. So then they had to go to another regional circuit somewhere around the world and prove themselves. And now here they are back in the show. But nonetheless, McGregor picked all the prospects that did not have the experience that a lot of these UFC guys had. And those are one of the things that you can truly judge off of that. So that's what you got going on with 2023. You had a couple of big matchups that we missed out on. Obviously, Alexander Usyk versus Tyson Fury was one of the things that we missed out on. But nonetheless, guess what? In replacement of that, in the same year, you're getting Francis Ngannou taking on Tyson Fury. You may not like that as a boxing pugilist or as a boxing purist, but for a lot of the MMA guys, there's going to be interest in that. And of course, the boxing world is going to show some sort of interest in that as well, to see how Tyson Fury fares with Francis Ngannou. Or do they think they know, or do we not know, based on the fact that Francis Ngannou has this one-shot knockout power that we've seen Tyson Fury get laid out from in previous fights, but has come back from, which makes this fight all that interesting. But his inexperience of the entire sport of boxing will come into play at some point, but do we really know? And that in of itself makes the fight intriguing. On October 14th, a week before that, or a week, right around there, October 14th, you have Dylan Dennis taking on Logan Paul. And then that's just the co-headline. How about the main headline of that, which is KSI taking on Tommy Fury? And you've seen the press conference and the crazy shenanigans that went on about that. Those are some of the things that we got to look forward to. And now, in October of 28th, 2023, you have UFC 283, I believe it is, or 284. But nonetheless, it's the card that's going to be in Abu Dhabi. And what is significant about that? Well, actually, 283 is Sydney with Strickland and Adesanya. And how about Strickland? He started off the year, this year started off with Imavov, Nazardine Imavov. He started off with him. Now he's getting a title shot. And obviously, you've seen that he has that win over Abus Magomedov. And here he is now getting a title shot with Israel Adesanya. How about a fight that got away? We're talking about fights that got away, right? The fact that Israel Adesanya was not able to fight Dricus du Plessis in September, which is something that he had planned for after Dricus du Plessis got that knockout against Robert Whittaker. And why is he not getting that matchup? Well, because of the fact that Dricus du Plessis feels that it is a fast turnaround. And not only is it a fast turnaround, it gives the advantage to Adesanya, and it's in his home turf, which is in the region of Australia, New Zealand, because the fight is taking place in Sydney, Australia at UFC 293, which is going to be not too far from now, somewhere around maybe September 9th or something to that effect, right? And right now we are in August of 24th of August. And then we're talking about September 9th, which is a couple of weeks away. So Strickland got the title shot. He's been active the entire year, so he got this fight. But amongst the other list of the fights that we mentioned that got away, Israel Adesanya and Dricus du Plessis is a big part of that. By the way, guys, check out my early predictions on the video section below with Israel Adesanya taking on Dricus du Plessis. I shot that in Southern California sometime during the summer, and I also did a post-fight review of UFC 290, which took place in Las Vegas with Volkanovski in his latest fight. And with the win of Dricus du Plessis and the face-off. And not only that, the racial implications that go into that fight. Now, you imagine the type of big money that UFC was going to make out of that, but it's not going to happen. Just like Francis Ngannou and John Jones is not going to happen, but in replacement of that, you have Tyson Fury taking on Francis Ngannou in a freak show fight of a boxing match. Nonetheless, Francis Ngannou stepping into the world of Tyson Fury. So how about the rest of the 2023, right? In looking back, because we still have more fights going on. Take a look at all the championship fights that have gone on in 2023 and the ones that are coming up. Obviously, you have John Jones with Stipe Miocic. The one that I mentioned in Abu Dhabi, you have Islam Makhachev taking on Charles Oliveira. And in that same card, you're going to have Khamzat Chimaev. You're going to have Mohamed Makayev on top of that. And then you have all these Dagestani all-stars that are going to be in that card. And obviously, it's in Abu Dhabi, so why would you not have them there? And then you're going to have Alexa Grasso taking on Valentina Shevchenko in a rematch. Obviously, you've seen the upset that she had against her, one of the biggest upsets of combat sports history, which happened not too long ago. And that's going to happen upcoming this year. Israel Adesanya Strickland, I had mentioned. Obviously, coming up just recently, you had Sean O'Malley with his big upset with Aljamain Sterling, which creates a big superstar out of him and creates more dollars for the UFC. Zhang Weili and Amanda Lemos, you've seen how that went to a decision. Now, as Zhang Weili has that championship experience under her belt. Yair Rodriguez and Alexander Volkanovski, I just mentioned at UFC 290. Alex Pantoja, how about the fact that he was able to beat Brandon Moreno, and with the great storyline that he has going on with his father abandoning his family and then mentioning it post-fight, just giving him a bigger boost into his profile. And then you had Aljamain Sterling early in the year defending his belt against Henry Cejudo, and this is all in 2023. And then you had Israel Adesanya once again beating Alex Pereira, fighting in front of Donald Trump in UFC 287. And then Alex Grasso, I just mentioned with the submission when she had over Valentina, that took place this year, which was in UFC 285. And then you had Islam Makhachev taking on Alexander Volkanovski, all in the same year, by the way. And you've seen that fight, how exciting that was, how controversial that was. Even though a lot of people really had Islam winning that fight, there were still some people saying that Volk had the moral victory of that fight or even won the whole entire thing. And then you had earlier the year, you had Jamal Hill, who later vacated his belt based on the fact that he was injured and wanted to do the right thing. And this is the same way that he got rewarded with that belt. How? He stepped up to the plate because Yuri and Jan Blachowicz weren't able to fight. And then when Jan Blachowicz fought Ankalaev, they went to a draw. So all these other factors going on, and then Yuri's injured. So now they're putting that fight or that championship belt on a vacancy for the next two upcoming contenders to fight for. And he beat Glover Teixeira by a 5-round decision in that one. And then Brandon Moreno, who lost his. All right. So if you guys want to see the rest of that particular video, look up on my video section 2023 greatest year in combat sports, MMA/boxing, the most epic year ever. Here's why. And then I talk about the different matchups. Obviously, I had talked about the Volkanovski versus Islam fight, which, by the way, 10 UFC pay-per-views later, they fight again, only for Islam Makhachev to head kick him into oblivion. Now, we're talking about 2023. I showed you guys the last particular fights of 2023 of that UFC 296 card, of that Almeida versus Lewis fight night card, and also the Brendan Allen versus who was Brendan Allen supposed to fight? I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I forgot who he was supposed to fight. Brendan Allen and Paul Craig. Yeah, sorry. Paul Craig lost there for a second. So, yeah, those are the last fights coming up in 2023. Now, before I finish and before I go, I want to talk about What are some of the big matchups that are going to happen for 2024? And also, how does 2023 currently go into effect 2024? Well, for one, you look at UFC 295. Obviously, John Jones was out. John Jones was taken out of the mix, and in comes Stipe. He's like, I'm not going to do it because I'm only here to fight John Jones because guess what? It's literally like the same thing that you see out of jiu-jitsu tournaments, right? They put you in segregated categories. Now, you want to talk about segregated categories in MMA and professional boxing where they segregate you into these different weight classes. In jiu-jitsu, they get down to the nitty-gritty of segregating you by not only weight, but by age, and not only by age and by weight, but by the belt level that you're at, and then not even by the belt level, the age and everything in between, literally the different experiences that you have with the belt. So in other words, not all black belts are the same in experience, and guess what, not all white belts are created in the same experience. So yeah, that's what you literally have with jiu-jitsu. It's like matchmaking down perfectly down to that T, right? Well, what are some of the matchmakings that you're going to see with Stipe and John Jones? This is the Masters division of the UFC, of the Jiu-Jitsu world. Because if you got guys that are over 35 or anything like that, they're going to match them up with other guys that are over 35, and they're going to call it the Masters division. So it's no wonder that Stipe doesn't want to take on somebody like Sergey or somebody like Tom Aspinall. And the same thing with John. These guys deserve to only fight each other, and then that's it. They don't deserve to fight anybody else or this and that. So, lo and behold, now we have a replacement for this UFC 295 card, right? Aspinall and Sergey as the co-main event, because obviously they can't be the main event. They had to elevate Alex Pereira and Jiri for that one, which, by the way, has a great storyline in of itself. If Jiri goes out and wins that one, boom, he wins another belt in another weight class, and then he wins two belts in two different weights, in two different sports, kickboxing and MMA. He wins two belts in that. It's a great story to have. And then Jiri obviously was the lineal champion before he had to give it up. So for him to win the entire thing again only solidifies him at the 205 division, which John Jones had left behind. So 2024 is going to leave us with Stipe and John Jones as a result of that. What else? Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler is going to be another choice that they're going to put up for 2024 as a big marquee matchup. Now, what about boxing? Let's talk about boxing. Alexander Usyk, guess what? He's got a shot at fighting Tyson Fury now that this Francis Ngannou fight is over. Guess what, guys? I'm going to tell you, Tyson Fury's not going to want a rematch for that, and he would be smart to get away from this. Because guess what? He has Usyk as an opportunity. Now is the time. You looked at Usyk during the fight. He was kind of graying a little bit. He looked like he had a little bit of a gray hair, looked like he's getting older. You know what? You know who did the same type of thing? None other than Floyd Mayweather. You know what he did? He literally did this, is what Tyson Fury is doing to Usyk right now. He waited him out until he became old, to the point where now Tyson Fury feels a whole lot more confident in going in there with Usyk, and he should do it because guess what? The way that Tyson Fury performed that night, the way that a lot of people are looking at it, he's never going to perform in the same way again, and it is the best time to take out Usyk because guess what? Usyk didn't look that much better against Daniel Dubois, who, by the way, was smashed into pieces by none other than Joe Joyce. And you look at Joe Joyce's performance against Zhang. So you do the math on that. Obviously, boxing math or MMA math doesn't always count because different styles are just going to present different challenges to different guys. So something to look out for. Okay, so here's a couple of things to understand about 2024. That fight is going to be right there in the horizon. It's going to be ready for Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk. He escaped this one in Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou gets to leave the winner of this one. He gets to go out and box the other big names in boxing now that people are intrigued in wanting to see it. And you would probably imagine Eddie Hearn wants to get up on it, knowing that maybe Anthony Joshua fancies this kind of fight. So that's something to look out in the horizon. Francis Ngannou, either in boxing or MMA or both. We're talking names like Anthony Joshua. We're talking names like Deontay Wilder. And then on the MMA side, being that he's on the PFL side, there's not a lot of exciting names that you can really get up for in that particular end, can you? So I guess you could try to make the John Jones fight because that's the next best case. The problem with that is that it's going to be very hard to make that fight because of the fact that guess what? John Jones is with the UFC and now Francis Ngannou is with PFL. Granted, they're both signed to the ESPN TV deals, which you could think maybe there's some sort of a Disney conglomerate to come in between them and say, hey, listen, this is the kind of money that we want to put up. Or I don't know, maybe have Uncle Ben Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, come in there and be like, hey, listen, we make this fight with UFC, PFL, and then maybe they could even throw an undercard with PFL versus UFC guys. And then the guys that defected from the UFC to the PFL, maybe they can create some kind of storyline about it, right? Similar to what happened when the WWE had an invasion angle from WCW and the NWO. That's when obviously Vince McMahon had bought WCW and created a storyline that Shane McMahon was the new owner of the WCW and created versus league type of matchup they had going on, right? And then Stone Cold even went and defected into the WCW, betraying WWE, right? That kind of storyline going on. So you can create that kind of cross promotional matchup because all throughout professional wrestling, MMA, and boxing, cross promotional storylines have been the biggest deal ever, right? You look at obviously Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather, that's a given, right? You had a guy who had his own promotion, and then here's this guy that was with Top Rank. And then you had Eddie Hearn, who was Matchroom, and then he broke away and did, I guess, opposite deals from Frank Warren, did different types of venues, different types of places as the other guys. And then in came Boxer, right? The Boxxer, the new promotion. So again, storylines are always a popular thing when promotional storylines are a popular thing. You look at Bellator, they do it all the time with Ryzen versus Bellator cards, right? Even though we know that Bellator had the better fighters, Ryzen still went out there and put their guys on the line. Now, the UFC can't do that because guess what? A lot of these guys come from different, let's say, drug testing systems, drug testing pools and whatnot. So, yeah, something to look out for, right? Now, the UFC is not that kind of league to do that. They tried to do that with M1 Global when Fedor was the man, right? When they tried to make that fight with either Randy Couture or Brock Lesnar or both. It just never happened because they are just not the kind of company that wants to share their pot of gold with anybody. But speaking of pot of gold, guess what? That's where Conor McGregor comes into the mix of this whole entire year of 2024 because he's been trying to get in for 2023. We were trying to get him to fight in the December card, right? Obviously, it's not going to happen for one reason or another, and that's that. How about this, right? How about the fact that Dylan Dennis could possibly be signed to the UFC? Now, that right there, I'm going to make another separate video on that. Dylan Dennis possibly signing to the UFC because it's not far-fetched. However, what I will say right now, if you're outraged by this, just remember the UFC signed CM Punk. The UFC signed James Toney, who had zero grappling experience. So I want you to think about that when they're signing Dylan Dennis. But I'm going to leave it off with this, right? Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm going to leave you with a video that I made 3 weeks ago that was basically going to head into the Logan Paul versus Dylan Dennis fight. It's called Khabib versus Dylan Dennis. This was in the anniversary of October the 6th between the fight of Khabib versus Conor McGregor. And obviously, you've seen what had happened in that particular fight where Dylan Dennis got jumped by Khabib right afterwards. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting. By the way, I'm going to leave you guys with this video. This is the last video that you guys are going to see before I sign off. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for all the new subscribers. Continue to watch all the way throughout the end. And please don't forget to recommend this to a friend so that we can become one of the biggest mixed martial arts channels in all of YouTube, because it has the potential to do so. Inshallah, I'm going to leave you with this. This is just a grudge match. And with anything that deals with a grudge, you're going to use any low hanging fruit to say whatever it is that you want to say to get under the skin of your opponent in order to get them to react in a result that you desire. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that works out in a multitude of different ways. For example, you take a look at Dylan Dennis's training partner, none other than Conor McGregor, which, by the way, this today, as this is being recorded, is the anniversary of when that fight between him and Khabib went down on October 6, 2018. Till this day, probably one of the highest pay-per-view events in the entire company's history, if not most of combat sports, at least within the top 3 or top 5 of the entire list of all time pay-per-view sales. But you look at how that ended. Dylan Dennis was on the receiving end of someone's wrath once again. And you got to ask yourself, what is it that this guy is doing that allows other people to get the best of them and get out of their character and do things that otherwise would be uncharacteristics of who they are? Now, would you put it past anybody that Paul would go out and sue somebody for leverage, for the possibility of being able to have one-upsmanship, especially with an upcoming fight going on? Although it is still quite strange that one fighter would sue another fighter prior to a fight, right? Because usually if two guys are signed to fight each other, it's usually within terms of a business agreement rather than more of somebody that is your enemy. Or in other words, you have some sort of Geneva Convention that is somehow getting in between this conflict or warfare you have going on in a sanctioned manner, meaning that you're agreed to not hit below the belt. You're not allowed to go out and take out innocent civilians or something to that extent. And then this is where the ethics of MMA, boxing, and prize fighting all go into this question of, well, what is the right thing to say in terms of promoting a fight, and what are the limits? Was religion the limits when Khabib took on Conor back in October 6, 2018? No, it wasn't a limit at all. In fact, Conor went there. He went there to the point where he tried to offer Khabib, a known religious, devout Salafi Muslim who doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't do anything. By the way, on a side note about Khabib, just for you guys to understand in full context and great disclosure, someone asked me, they saw a picture of Khabib leading a prayer full of Dagestani fighters, and obviously most of them were Dagestani, but mostly Muslim fighters of different fighters from around the world that trained in his team. They asked, hey, is there a reason why Khabib is leading the prayer? You know what my answer was? My answer was, for the same reason why he's leading the prayer is for the same reason why he is world champion. And what do you mean by that? I explained to them what exactly I mean by that is that in order for you to lead prayer in an Islamic prayer or in a mosque or in a congregation, it's agreed upon that within that group of men or women, the man that has the most knowledge in terms of Islamic education and in terms of understanding the Quran, understanding the Hadith, the history of Islam, and things of that nature, gets to be the one that leads the prayer. So he asked me, so you mean that there's a reason why Khabib is world champion? Absolutely. There's no there's no doubt about it. Now, that's another thing you got to ask about this whole Dylan Dennis thing, right? He's marking into a territory of two unknowns. Number one, being the first fighter in the entire history in the sport of boxing to be sued before a fight. That's number one. Number two, he has to also contend with the fact that, yes, he is an absolute monster world champion in the sport of jiu-jitsu, but he's walking into a boxing ring. Now, granted, the other story of that is it's not like Logan had this marvelous career of a Floyd Mayweather resume or even as much of a Tony Bellew to that extent. But the one question, other than the technicalities and the fighting resumes of these men, is the code of ethics that I think a lot of people are debating upon this fight, which is the reason why it attracts a certain type of attention that it does. Now, I'm not going to try to get into this whole manosphere red pill conversation that these other guys do. I'm going to let them do that. That's their specialty. But it's worth noting that is it is it morally correct for Logan to approach someone like this at his time of his life during versus her time of her life and coming into this situation knowing all these past occurrences, and he's okay with that? And this is one of the things that I wanted to comment on when him and Jake had that podcast with him and his buddies, Jake and his buddies, and then Logan was the guest and whatnot, which is recent within this week of October 2023, right? The one thing that was significant was the cognitive dissonance that they had going on, right? I had noticed Jake mentioned something to the effect of, well, today, these days, a lot of people are not in it for the long haul. He's talking about like a relationship or a marriage. And I'm thinking, okay, you know what? This is for the same reason why people are attacking you for this infraction of a moral code, is for the same reason that you're also sort of supporting it through allowing your brother to go through this particular arrangement with Agdal. So it was quite interesting to see the dynamic of that, because the thing is, like I said in the beginning of part one, right? There is no right or wrong between these two guys because they're both immoral in their own way. Dylan Dennis happens to be the type of guy that can provoke a wrath out of the best of us, out of the most calmest of us. If you've remembered what Khabib did, jumping out of the cage and doing an eagle stomp on him right after the entire fight with Conor McGregor, all because of the buildup. And then the possible alleged racial, or I'm sorry, religious uh, bashing that he made towards Khabib in the fight, in the lead up, and during the fight day, all at the same time. So, once again, this is a great lesson for people to understand, is that when it comes to the many scumbags that are involved in the fight game, and I'm not saying any of these guys are that or the other, but you guys out there are making up your mind as to who is what and who isn't. So, either way, you have to understand that when you see this with other fighters and other storylines and other conflicts from around the world, whether it be small or whether it be from an actual warfare point of view between countries or between rebels, insurgencies versus an actual state and things of this nature, or just a sanctioned prize fight situation that we're witnessing or talking about in this particular moment of time. Either way, there is no good guy or bad guy. There are only interests, and there are only decisions made by what is best for you and the people that are on your side and forget everyone else. Literally, forget everyone else because I'd like you to like and subscribe.